Oxford Martin School in which he is based. He's also a fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET, which does very interesting work, both fostering new economic thinking, but also bringing in new scholars and so on. So he's also associated with that. And he has been working for many years on the issue of technological change, automation, implications for not only jobs and the labor market, but societies in general. He's one of the, well, he's the person who's associated with one of the famous figures which is out there on the impact of automation on the US job market. The number of jobs that stand to be lost through automation. That has been much used and abused later after he did the work of which he bears no responsibility. But nevertheless, the work is very interesting and a lot to think about in the Indian context as well and the developing country context broadly. So after he's done with his talk, his work is largely based on the developed country context, but then after that, Radhika Kapoor is here from ICRIER and Srinivas Iyer is also here from Ford Foundation. So all three of us will engage Carl on his work and then we'll open it out to questions. So he'll speak first for about 35-40 minutes, followed to him and then followed by audience Q&A. We'll plan to wrap it all up by 7:30 or so. So welcome Carl, and as a token or whatever you want to call it, I'm going to give you a copy of our State of Working India report, which never lose chance to plug it. Those of you who don't know, this is the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. You can visit our website and download the report as well, this one and the previous one.
Sorry, the lecture is off. I need to sit down and read it. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So how many of you actually choose to come here? Ah, good. How many of you were forced to come here? Okay, that was one hand up over there. So I'm obliged to ask because the Oxford ethics guidelines on this issue is very strict. Anyhow, so it's a great pleasure to be here and having the opportunity to share with you some thoughts from my new book, The Technology Trap, which tries to put current times in historical perspective. So as was mentioned earlier, a few years ago, Michael Osborne, as an associate professor in machine learning at Oxford University, and I published a study estimating roughly 47% of American jobs are at risk of automation. And since then, we've been asked at every single conference, is this time different somehow, right? And I remember thinking to myself, different compared to what, right? Because history is not just, the past and the future. We had very different episodes in history. And what I try to argue in the book is that we can learn something from them. Now, the lecture today is going to be somewhat Western biased. I hope you bear with me. But I do think and hope that there are also some conclusions and lessons that can be drawn for a country like India. And hopefully we can get to discussing some of those more in details also later on when there's an option for questions and answers and so on. So as some of you, and probably most of you will have noted, we are living in a period of automation anxiety with few workers feeling enthusiastic about the tornado that is coming for the office. And in fact, a majority of Americans now think that governments should introduce restrictions on the number of machines that businesses can implement with the objective of replacing workers. For an economic historian, that may seem puzzling. At least at the very first lecture that I took in economic history, I was told that the very last thing that we should worry about is machines taking our jobs. Because for a long time, economic growth was slow and stagnant. It was only around 1800 with the first industrial revolution, the first machine age, and the mechanization of factory production, that we were able to produce more with fewer people. And as a result of that, we've grown richer and richer and ever richer since. This is obviously a vast simplification, but it is true that the average person in the United Kingdom is around 40 times richer today than they were back in 1750, adjusted for inflation. And comparing incomes like that over centuries makes little sense, because the consumer basket an average person in Britain has access to today is very different from the consumer basket that the person in 1750 would have had access to, right? Think minor inventions like antibiotics, automobiles, telephones, refrigerators, dishwashers, and so on and so forth were not even thinkable back then. And today they are part of everyday life for most people. And they have actually had an enormously equalizing effect as well. If you think about it, in 1900, when Jane Austen, around 1800, when Jane Austen wrote the novels about the lives of the upper classes, right? Ordinary people could only look at their lives in envy, who had servants to do most tedious things for them. Today, most people in the United Kingdom have access to the electric servant in terms of a host of household machines that are actually relieve them of a lot of tedious work in the household. And if that's not enough evidence on progress, consider the fact how much people's working lives in the West have improved. Not so long ago, most Britons worked in agriculture and coal mining, similar to some countries in the East and to some extent India, right? And in those places, people didn't see daylight in the coal mines for sometimes weeks. Cave-ins and explosions were part of everyday working life. Lung disease often came as a part of the work package. Today, most of us work in air-conditioned offices, and that is largely the consequence of technology. So earning those higher incomes and producing all of those new goods have become much more comfortable as well. And this is not just a sectoral transformation. If you think about an occupation as farming, right? A person today in India will probably often work the fields with nothing more than animal power. If you go to the United Kingdom, a person in the very same occupation will sit in his or her air-conditioned tractor and listen to the music of his or her choice. So it's a very, very different occupation, although it has the same name in official classifications. So the long-run story of technological change is rather a cheerful and wonderful story. I'm here to tell you that, unfortunately, it is just half the story. So what did people in the United Kingdom actually say at the time of the Industrial Revolution? Well, people actually had very different opinions about it. So Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, published a novel called Coningsby in 1844, in which one character remarks that I see cities peopled with machines. Certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times. The very same year, Frederick Engels published his Conditions of the Working Classes in England, which was published actually during a stay in Manchester. And unlike most industrialists, Engels thought that machinery only serves to downgrade workers, deprive them of their jobs and incomes, and Marx obviously also later adopted this in his famous Das Kapital, arguing that machinery only would lead to the continued immiseration of the working class. Now, we know that they were wrong about the future, but they were actually fairly right about the past, because even as the British economy took off, and output per capita grew by 46, almost 50% between 1770 and 1840. Real wages were stagnant on average, and even falling on the bottom end of the income distribution. And as a result of this, people's nutrition was adversely impacted as well. So the courts born in 1750 were actually taller than the courts born in 1850. And what was the reason for this? Well, part was obviously the unhealthy work and living conditions that the emerging factory towns produced. But a big part of the story was also the replacement of middle-income artisan jobs with very simple factory jobs that were often actually taken on by children. And in fact, early spinning machines were specifically designed to be run by children to reduce labor costs in production. And the loser from this was essentially middle-income artisan workers who had earned their living, working at their own pace, often in the home, surrounded by their families. So a key question that economists and economic historians need to answer when discussing this is that why would people have voluntarily agreed to participate in the industrialization process if it actually reduced their utility? The simple answer is that they didn't. They petitioned to Parliament to block the introduction of machinery. They published their thoughts and feelings about mechanization in verse, like the following one, and they rioted against the mechanized factory on several occasions. And while much public commentary has focused on the Luddite riots, who smashed machinery in Nottinghamshire between 1811 and 1816, they were only part of a long wave of riots that swept across Britain, continental Europe, and even China. So clearly there was a lot of resistance to mechanization. And how did the British government respond? Actually, not so uncommonly, by sending out troops against the rioters. So the army sent against the Luddites, for example, was actually larger than the army that Wellington took against Napoleon in 1808. And so the big difference in Britain was not the absence of the resistance to machinery. The big difference was actually that governments began to side with the pioneers of industry rather than angry workers, whereas in France, for example, during the revolutionary era, governments were not strong enough to impose mechanization on the working population. And as a result of that, Britain was the first country to industrialize. So I think it's important to remember that what began with the construction of the first factories and ended with the construction of the first railroad between Liverpool and Manchester also ended with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. A lot of political or a lot of revolutionary technologies brought a lot of political revolutionaries along the way. Now, I'm not here to predict a socialist revolution, but we have seen recently that income inequality in the United Kingdom and also in the US is approaching levels that we haven't seen since the days of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are many factors that underpin these trends. Technology is just one of them, but I think it's the predominant long-run trend, and that's certainly the trend that I'm going to focus on today. Now, what has happened in technology recently? Computers have been with us for a long time, right? And the first electronic computer was developed at the University of Pennsylvania in 1946. But it was so big that you couldn't have fitted it into this room. As a result of that, it had virtually no impact whatsoever on production. It was only with the invention of the microprocessor and later the spread of the personal computer that automation began to have a real impact on labor markets from the 1980s onwards. And this has been good for very many people and in the United States and in other advanced economies. And certainly for people like myself, I can use statistical software now to write a lot of more papers than I could have 40 years ago, had I lived then. And secondly, I'm able to export my ideas to the global marketplace and get invitations to places like Bangalore to give talks, which is very nice as well. And that would have been inconceivable with the invention, without the invention of the computer. But it hasn't been as good for everyone. And it hasn't been good, especially for prime-age men who would have flocked into the factories before the age of automation. And what you see here in this figure is that the wages of men with no more than a high school degree have actually fallen in real terms for 3 consecutive decades as their earnings potential has been diminished, both by globalization, I should say, but also very much by automation. And this is a trend we're not just seeing in the United States. We see that middle-income jobs have been disappearing, middle-skill and middle-income jobs have been disappearing across the industrial West. Some people with a college degree mostly have fared quite well from this because they've adjusted by shifting into professional services or sometimes the tech sector, and where they usually earn higher wages than they would have in manufacturing industry. But low-skilled workers have not fared as well from this, and many have actually dropped down to low-income service occupations. So what essentially happens in a city like Bangalore when you create a new tech job is that that person goes out in the local service economy, spends his or her money on services, and that creates a host of new jobs in the local service economy. As you go to the hairdresser, you take a taxi, you go grocery shopping, and so on and so forth. And this is essentially what is behind this polarization of the labor market that you see in this figure here. Now, this hasn't occurred evenly across space either. There's a lot of differences in rates of technology adoption across geographies, and not just between countries, within countries as well. In the American Rust Belt, for example, is where most of the robots are. There are more robots in the state of Michigan alone than in the entire American West. And where the robots are is also where most of America's social problems today are. We see that in communities where manufacturing jobs have disappeared, you've seen deteriorating public services, you've seen worsening health outcomes, you've seen increases in crime, you've seen increases in rate of suicide, and this speaks to larger literature that shows that having a job is very important to people's mental well-being. This is something that has been proven for very many countries, including India, also in different periods of time. So we see that the disappearance of job is having a lot of social consequences as well. And it's having political consequences too, because if you want to explain why 3 key swing states, being Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, who were firmly in democratic hands every election since 1992, all of a sudden ended up being won by the Republican candidate, automation is one of the key reasons. And my concern is that we have seen nothing yet, because as artificial intelligence and machine learning becomes more pervasive, so will automation and its effects. It used to be the case that automation was very much confined to routine, rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. But what we're seeing now with machine learning is that computers are increasingly able to infer the rules of the game themselves. They can learn very much the way we do through trial and error, or by tapping into our experience through digitization and big data sets that are emerging from that. And if you think about autonomous vehicles, for example, in the United Kingdom, we now have Q-bots, which deliver food and medicines in hospital. It's fairly straightforward to program those robots because you can foresee most most situations that they will encounter, because they operate in a very structured environment. So if a person comes in front of the robot, it's simply programmed to stop, right? If you were to drive in Bangalore city traffic, which I'm sure you have more experience in than I do, I can tell you that there is no computer programmer in the world that can foresee every given situation that you will encounter. So it's completely impossible to program a car to drive. What you can do though, is that you can collect millions and millions gigabytes of data on people's driving behavior. And you can try to predict what the human driver would have done in any given situation. And that is essentially, with some oversimplification, what is driving recent advances in autonomous cars. It's also what driving Google Translate, what's driving improvements in medical diagnostics, in document review, and so on and so forth. So this is really general purpose technology that can be applied across a variety of domains. Now, when I say this, I often get the response that, well, autonomous vehicles, where are they? And Google Translate, it's not that great, is it? I used it yesterday and it produced fairly poor results. But the same can be said about every revolution in technology, the reason being that every technological revolution begins with imperfect technology. The early steam engines were mainly used to drain coal mines, and even that they didn't do particularly well. Yet eventually they became the prime drivers of the first industrial revolution. A second thing I often hear is that, well, because these technologies make so many mistakes, shouldn't we, rather rely on humans? Well, I think it's important to remember that in the United States alone, there were 30,000 deaths in traffic only last year. I don't know how many there was in India, but I would suspect it wasn't fewer. And we don't make mistakes just when driving cars. We make mistakes in all sorts of domains, right? And this is a study of Israeli judges and their decision-making during the day. And you can see that after people had their morning snack and insulin levels are high, we make a very high share of favorable decision, right? That then drops off during the day as insulin levels decline. And then you see the same pattern again after breakfast and after lunch, right? So we are very much affected in our behavior by, whether we slept enough, whether we eaten well, and so on and so forth. And algorithms are not. So in many domains, algorithms are likely to have a comparative advantage just because of that. I think it is also important to remember that technology doesn't have to reproduce exactly what the human worker is doing to replace the person in that task, right? We didn't automate away the jobs of lamplighters by building robots capable of climbing lampposts, right? We didn't automate away the jobs of laundresses by building robots that would walk out from the home, chop down trees, carry in buckets of woods from the well, then heat the water on the stove and perform all the motions of hand washing, right? We did that by inventing the electric washing machine, which does an entirely different set of motions, but with the same results. And I think it's also important to remember that even with state-of-the-art technology, we couldn't replicate the motions of a medieval craftsman, right? It would be completely inconceivable. The way we automated factory work was by dividing it into very specialized tasks, then applying machinery to those very specialized tasks, and then gradually, as computers came along, getting rid of the operators. So simplification is mostly how automation happens. And this is true for a variety of occupations. However, there are still a number of domains in which algorithms perform quite poorly. And complex social interaction is one such domain. So a couple of years ago, some people argued that it was a breakthrough when one chatbot managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old Russian boy with no understanding of English culture, speaking English as a second language. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions that you do in your daily jobs, when you try to convince your teacher that you should have a better grade, or when you argue something in front of the class, or we negotiate with people and so on and so forth, it's almost inconceivable that we will have computers capable of reproducing those more complex social interactions in the near future. The same, I believe, goes with creativity as well. Now, there's a big debate in the machine learning community as to whether computers can actually be creative. But I would argue that most people who think that they can be tend to conflate creativity and novelty. So it's not a problem to come up with a novel recombination of a piece of music, for example. If you're a Mozart fan, right, you can collect a database of symphonies and you can label all the Mozart symphonies as the good ones and the rest are not that good, and the algorithm might be able to come up with a recombination for you that will no doubt sound quite similar to Mozart. But you're not going to arrive at Arvo Pärt or Stravinsky by doing that. And the reason for that is that in many different fields, we draw upon a very deep reservoir of tacit knowledge from experiences from all sorts of domains of life. An artist may even draw upon a dream, right? It doesn't just, create something on the basis of pre-existing symphonies. So in very many cases, the relevant data is going to lie outside the data set. Besides that, there's a big debate going on in the machine learning community right now on whether we need to actually understand the basic structure of how the brain functions to reach human level creativity, for example, or whether you can just do it with bigger data sets and brute force. So there's no sort of clear conceptual path of getting there in the first place. So it might happen at some point in the future, but that would most likely be past my lifetime, and then the computer can explain to you why I was wrong, and there's no need for me either. There's a third bottleneck as well, which I almost forgot to mention, which has to do with the perception and manipulation of irregular objects, right? So if you go into your home, I'm sure all of you are much more tidy than I am, but sometimes even I struggle to distinguish between documents that are very important and documents that just lie around and are rubbish. And there's even sometimes disagreement about what's an important document and what's rubbish. So my wife tends to disagree with me on that from time to time. And so you can imagine how difficult it is for a machine to actually make such distinctions, and even simple things like distinguishing between a pot that is dirty and needs to be cleaned and a pot that holds a plant. It's very easy for us to sort of think about intuitively, but it's very hard to actually specify what the difference is. And so I'm afraid that the automated cleaner is one of the last things we are going to automate, which is the reason that many of my colleagues entered the field in the first place. They thought that they could make a real difference there. Anyhow, so the big questions then obviously is how intensive are jobs actually in tasks that correspond to these engineering bottlenecks of automation? It turns out that actually quite a big chunk of work is not very intensive in creative tasks and complex social interactions. According to our estimates, roughly 47% of jobs, which we mentioned earlier, are at risk of automation as a consequence of this. And this is not just confined to one single domain. A lot of jobs in transportation, logistics, warehouses, retail, construction, and production, obviously, is at risk of automation as a result of that. Now, that doesn't mean that all of those jobs are going to be automated away in the near future. You know, businesses, when they make decisions to automate, have to factor in a variety of variables, including the cost of scrapping old equipment, the cost of financing new equipment, whether there are sufficiently large markets for automation to make sense, whether there are legislative hurdles. So even if Google Translate becomes perfect tomorrow, in certain domains you still need a certified translator for the translation to be valid. So unless we certify Google Translate, it is not going to replace those jobs, right? But it is certainly true, though, that automation is already making unexpected inroads. So when we published our study almost 6 years ago now, we also published a very detailed list of 702 occupations and their relative exposure to automation. And one of the jobs that our algorithm deemed to be automatable was fashion models. And our colleagues used to tease us for this for years. One day they actually stopped teasing us, and I wondered why. And then it occurred to me that, well, now actually automated fashion models exist. So these fashion models on these pictures actually don't exist, for example. They have been generated by generative adversarial networks from thousands of pictures. And they're already being used by companies you can see like Dior. That being said, I do think that there are important differences to some episodes in the past. And when it comes to the first industrial revolution, where there are a lot of similarities, the big difference actually lies in the area of political economy. So the Nobel Prize-winning economist Leontief once joked that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They might have used their political voice to bring the spread of the tractor to a halt. Now, I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I do note that we are seeing, at least in the West, growing resistance to mechanization yet again. So these are dock workers in Los Angeles a couple of months ago that went on strike over the fear of job loss due to the introduction of robots in their workplace. They did misunderstand our study slightly, so we didn't say that government planned to automate all of these jobs. It's not a conspiracy, but nonetheless, I think that they are right in fearing for their own jobs. A similar issue has occurred recently in Missouri, with truck drivers worrying about self-driving trucks taking their jobs. In verbal terms, the local congressman has actually sided with the workers and proposed legislation to ban autonomous trucks. Whether that will happen or not, time will tell. But we can see that in very different industries and also in different places, there seems to be growing resistance to these technologies. So in European Parliament, for example, robot tax was only very narrowly voted down recently as a mean of slowing down the pace of automation. In Britain, the opposition party, and Jeremy Corbyn in particular, has also been talking about robot taxes to slow down the pace of automation. Now, I don't think that the worry is necessarily that there is not going to be jobs to come in the future. I think the worry is more what jobs at what wage. And we have seen in the past 30 years or so that very many new job titles have emerged that didn't exist back in the 70s and 80s. So things like database administrators and software engineers and all of these occupations didn't exist in official classifications in the 1970s. But if you look at where these jobs have emerged, they tend to be highly clustered in cities with very skilled populations. And skilled populations also want to live in places where they have more job options. Businesses want to be in places where they have access to more pools of talent. It's very natural. And places also very much benefit from being close to each other. If you have a conversation with 10 people here in Bangalore, and that tend to be more informed than the average population, they in turn will also have had conversations with 10 other people, who would in turn have conversations with 10 other people. And so some of the best ideas get filtered down to you because you are in this particular city. What also happens is that because these jobs tend to be so highly clustered, consumer demand for in-person type of services, which can only be delivered locally, also makes economic growth even more concentrated to these places. I mentioned earlier that there is a multiplier in the US context of 5. One tech job creates 5 new jobs in the local service economy. Conversely, in places where manufacturing jobs are being automated away, the local service economy is also taking a hit, because those jobs also supported other jobs locally as those people went out and spent money. Now, I don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be, and I think that if you would have asked somebody in 1900 in Britain, what do you think your grandson is going to do? That person would not have said, well, obviously she's going to be a software engineer, or he's going to be a hot yoga instructor, or a travel agent, or obviously they're all going to work in nanotechnology. Nobody would have suggested that. And in similar fashion, I think I'm very ill-placed to predict what the jobs of the future will be. But LinkedIn did a little study recently on their platform on the fastest growing new and emerging occupations. And on that list, you find jobs like social media interns, Android developers, data scientists, and also Zumba instructors. Right? And if you go down a bit further, you find jobs like big data architects and Beachbody coaches. And if you look at official statistics in the US, sommelier, it's an old job, but it's only very recently emerged as a separate job title, because as we grow richer, we tend to demand more such services. So my prediction is that this trend is likely to continue, with some very high-skilled jobs emerging, so those people creating more demand for in-person types of services, also healthcare as we grow older. And that is good news in the sense that those jobs are a lot more interesting than many of the jobs that exist now, or certainly existed 100 years ago. But it's bad news in the sense that people that are likely to be replaced by machines today are unlikely to find work in those occupations. And I know that some of you are economic students, and the simple message of this presentation is just that technological change is welfare improving. It makes us better off on average, but it's not a Pareto improving. It doesn't make everybody better off, at least in the short run. And as the British Industrial Revolution illustrates, the short run can be a long time, a lifetime for some. And as Keynes pointed out, in the long run, we're all dead. Now, I actually think that we have, we all have a commitment to future generations as well. I think that economic growth is good over the long run. I think that people's lives have improved enormously due to technology. I think that's unquestionable. But I also think that we need to think very carefully about how to help and compensate the losers in the short run, because otherwise they may actually opt against it. And that is indeed already what's happening in the West with globalization, and automation has had very similar effects. So I think that's probably a good place to stop, and maybe we can continue the conversation on stage. Thanks very much. Okay, perfect.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. A lot of examples also to kind of hold on to in a way. What I'll do is, I'll just start off with some very quick observations. I think most of the time I'd like the students and other people to get a chance to ask. There's a lot of interesting questions to raise. So a few things, and then I'll pass on to Radhika and Srini, and we can take it from there. So those of you who don't know, I introduced earlier, this is Radhika Kapoor, who worked a lot on jobs in the Indian context and has written a lot. Most would have read her writings too. She's at ICRIER in Delhi. And this is Srini Iyer, who's at the Ford Foundation, also one of the key people who has been supporting research on issues like inequality, structural change, jobs, and so forth. I'll just make a few points coming from a kind of developing economy in India perspective. But before that, actually, also more general point on the developed world as well. I was very struck to learn that the size of the army sent for the Ladakh was larger than Wellington. So I mean, this is a very striking kind of comparison. And that kind of leads to the question, where is that resistance? There is resistance to automation even today, but perhaps not of that kind. And what does it say about the zeitgeist maybe in a way that have people accepted the disruptions of technology a lot more 200 years later than at that time when this was a very new kind of development, and maybe there were people who had been brought up in a context where they just were really refusing to accept it. Is that what's going on? That's the first thing. On the political shift to the right, that's also a very interesting thing a lot written about in the American context, also the European context now. For us too, there's a very interesting dimension here, and I'm not necessarily saying that you not know much about it, but the rise of the right in India and possibly in other developing countries too surely can to some extent be tied into what's happening in the labor market also, because in the end you are drawing on frustrations of youth or on insecurity of the future and so forth, very similar kinds of things. Where it goes, of course, we don't know, and it's always open. Where it's going to go into progressive directions or right-wing and so on. But I think there is something like that possibly happening here too. And I'd like your sense as an outsider of what that will mean. And then finally, the really important question for us is for an economy that is trying to achieve structural change in the context of a very, very different technological landscape. So we are now, we are sort of late, we're not late industrializers, we're not late industrializers, we are late, or however many lates you want to add to that. So we are not Russia or Japan, we are not Korea, we are also not China. So we are trying to do this in a very different context. Is it even, I mean, this of course requires speculation, but I'd like to know what you think. Is it even possible to imagine that a large economy like this can achieve that kind of structural change? Even in services, I'm not necessarily even saying that only manufacturing, but even modern services, can they absorb the surplus labor of the kind that we have in India? And if the private, if the market economy is not able to generate that kind of employment, either because it competes in a global context, firms don't have that much choice to automate, whether to automate or not, and so forth. So if the private economy is not able to generate the required number of good quality jobs at all, what are then the avenues for public, what kind of public policy are we talking about? There's a debate in the West about UBI and so forth, where you sort of give up on the idea that some people might have much of jobs at all, and you just go to transfers. Right? But if you don't want to think of transfers, what else could you do? Those are my 3 points. Should we?
Maybe let him respond. He might miss a
Yes, there was a, I think I still have the microphone. There was a lot of food for thought in there. So I think on the first point, I think there's always been groups that have benefited from the status quo, right? So there's always been resistance to mechanization. If you go to a country like Argentina, one of the reasons that you find very few railroads is that the lorry unions are extremely strong, and they have very little interest in railroads substituting for the work that they are doing. But what I think has changed is that resistance used to be the norm rather than the exception. And intellectually, most people before the Industrial Revolution couldn't even imagine that their living standards could improve over the short, long, and medium term as a result of it, right? All they saw was a threat to their jobs. And I think what's changed sentiment, and you see very few machinery riots in the industrial West after, let's say, 1850. And what happened is essentially, as wages take off, people see that technological progress can actually work in their interest. And growth has actually become more of an expectation than anything else, which has also very much sort of shifted what the governments need to do to keep people happy, right? It used to be the case that governments feared for social unrest as technology substituted for people's jobs, and the short-run consequences for that, and as a result of that, they blocked the introduction of new technology. As political power in Britain shifted to the new merchant class that became increasingly wealthy, but also more politically powerful, they essentially enforced mechanization on the population. Much, much later, the working population began to see their wages rise. They began to see more opportunity emerging for them in the labor market. And I think, Marx would probably have been right in his prediction of a socialist revolution if that had not happened. So I think that people in the early 20th century and the sort of mid-20th century could reasonably expect the wages to continue to rise because that then became the new normal. What we've seen over the past 3 decades is a reversal of that tendency, and I think people are no longer taking for granted that technological progress will inevitably translate into better living standards for them. And I think that is also leading to a shift in sentiment that we are seeing. With regard to the political right, my view of this is quite simple, right? If you go back and look at post-electoral surveys from the 60s and 50s, what you find is that high-income voters used to vote for the political right, low-income, low-education voters used to vote for the political left. What's happening since the 70s, 80s is increasingly that high-income voters continue to vote for the political right, but that high-education voters are now more associated with the political left. And they have a somewhat more different agenda. They care more about global issues like climate change and equality and things like that. And the result of this is that the old working class, of which many are quite conservative still, has become essentially politically disenfranchised, and the populists are very effectively tapping into their anger. Fortunately, or in a way I'm not sure, they don't have any solutions to this either. So I think what the political landscape will look in at some years from now will depend on whether liberal parties actually manage to come up with feasible solutions to this problem. Otherwise, I have no idea what is going to happen politically. There was a last question there as well, which I...
Basically, from a perspective of developing economies, you're going to achieve structural change in the backup of this kind.
Right, yeah. So the question was whether it's possible. So I think, China has essentially proven that it's possible, but it's also done it during an early period of time, and whether you can just replicate that, I think that's quite hard. And we don't know of any country that has successfully grown rich by leapfrogging industrialization. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, and you can probably still grow by improving institutions, by investing in education, in infrastructure, and so on and so forth. The construction sector usually generates a lot of jobs as well during the development phase. But it may not lead to growth of, sort of 8-9%. It may be growth of 2 or 3%, but that is not necessarily too bad either.
Thank you, Carl. I've heard your talk multiple times, but each time you present, I think of something different. So you do a great job of presenting each time and presenting in a different way. Having worked on the subject of future work, we're so used to hearing that it's happened in the past, we've dealt with it, so we're going to deal with it. But I think there's such little understanding of what actually happened in the past, how labor was in fact displaced, how it reacted to it, that your book I think makes a very important contribution in understanding how all those changes happened in the first place and how we reacted to it. So it's totally understandable where the Luddites came from, and so if you see these adverse reactions and this resistance to technological change, it's actually not quite irrational. Now I won't focus my comments so much on the global south, but so you showed this slide about job polarization, and then this whole literature about the hollowing out of the middle and the job polarization. Now, when that literature was being written, essentially, I think the idea was that machines could not do cognitive and non-routine tasks. But ever since that literature has been written, there have been considerable advances, in particular, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and you yourself showed several slides in your presentation which talk about that. So I was thinking that, given that you've had all these rapid technological changes, the fact that machines can now also do these cognitive, non-routine tasks, how is that going to affect the job polarization hypothesis and also maybe the wage polarization? Because, for instance, now, doctors, in a way you could argue that the medical diagnosis can be done by machines, the laser can do the surgery, so the doctor really doesn't have much of a job. He essentially maybe has to go in there, empathize with the patient, break the bad news that, okay, this is the disease you have, so on and so forth. So in that sense, the wage premium that he perhaps derived from his cognitive skills or the medical skills, do you think that's going to get affected in some way? Also, some of these technologies that we're seeing, like artificial intelligence and machine learning, are they in fact giving more brain power to the middle skilled? So do you think that in some way is going to affect the whole distribution of income or the job polarization hypothesis? I mean, just think of doctors vis-a-vis nurses or lawyers vis-a-vis paralegals. So I'm thinking like that. Do you think it's going to benefit doctors less than it's going to benefit nurses, or lawyers less than it's going to benefit paralegals? Also, so we think of individuals in this discussion largely in their capacities as producers or workers, but in their capacity as consumers. Do you think as consumers there are certain things that human beings would not want to automate? So therefore, that might put a cap on the extent of automation. Then the other question I had was that you showed this slide about the geography of new jobs and how there was clustering that was happening in areas which were very highly skilled. But on the flip side, what we also see is that with all this digital technology, there's a rise of the virtual workplace, there's remote workers. So there's also going to be relocation of jobs across, and so there's going to be some distributional flows between the north and the south. I mean, if there might be a job that somebody sitting in Bangalore, a highly skilled worker sitting in Bangalore, can do far cheaper than someone sitting in the Bay Area. So that's also going to have distributional implications on the flow of jobs between the global north and south. So if you could say something on that. And finally, because we are sitting with students who are going to enter the workforce soon, I'm curious to know what you have to say to them in terms of how they should prepare themselves for changes in the workplace. What I got from your slide, the very interesting slide you showed from LinkedIn, it was interesting to see that where the demand would lie in the future, there was more demand for Zumba instructors, not just in percentage terms, but in absolute terms compared to data scientists. So what do you draw from that? I mean, should they not be spending their time doing coding and instead maybe on socio-behavioral skills?
I think there may be some bias there towards Hollywood. I'm not sure exactly how they sample that. No, jokes aside. So clearly, the world is not going to become one cluster, right? It's going to be probably very many different clusters, and you see that in India already. I mean, the financial city, if I understand it correctly, is Mumbai. IT is here, and you know, creative industries, both in the US, tend to cluster as well, but sometimes in very different places. And you always also have other things that offset clustering, right? So congestion is a big thing, right? If air pollution becomes so much of an issue that you can't live more people in one city, you're going to have industry locating elsewhere, for example. The same is true with housing supply and house prices. One reason that firms are now actually starting to move out of the Bay Area is that there's a lot of zoning restrictions, which means that housing supply can't keep pace with demand. Prices are now becoming so high that many entrepreneurs can't simply afford to live there, and they're now moving to Austin and other places as a result of that. So it's not the case that everything is going to be in one city, but we had a similar debate back in the 1990s when people argued that the office was about to come to an end and people would just work remotely from home or from the beach. And Edward Glaser wrote at the time an article asking, are cities dying? And he pointed out that there are significant knowledge spillovers, among other things, between many of those industries which lead them to cluster. And he's been proven right so far. So even as the cost of distance had declined over the past 30 years, urbanization has, if anything, accelerated, and I don't see that, and that is likely to change in the near future. And I don't think it's likely to change at all, because we are also social creatures, and we like, most of us, to be around other people. Even I like being around other people, and I'm Swedish, so that tells you something. With regard to job polarization, I actually worry that we're going to see even more polarization looking forward, because I mean, if you look at the LinkedIn slide, and we shouldn't use that to predict, extrapolate into the future, but I think it suggests, an intuitive trend which has been going on for some time, that people are increasingly working in either very productive sectors of the economy or in very technologically stagnant sectors of the economy, and that is what's sort of driving much of these disparities. And I think there will be continued demand for in-person type of services. The good news, I think, is that for future generations at least, I mean, I'd rather be a Zumba instructor than working in the factory in the middle of nowhere. So, I mean, I think there are other issues that play into, the quality of jobs than incomes as well. But I do think that it's an issue and one that we should be concerned of. And, hopefully countries can use the tax system, for example, to make the income distribution more even. And, I mean, if you think about countries like Norway or Saudi Arabia, both countries have essentially, money coming out of the ground, but it's very differently distributed. So institutions play a huge role in all of this. So it's all solvable problems, but I think you're definitely right in pointing out that they don't get solved by themselves. They have to be solved.
Thank you. I have one comment, one question, and an invitation. So it's a now the comments more, in fact, by clarifying what I hear you say, is that the moment of the emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning is a very, very significant moment. Enough, in fact, to be even labeled as the cusp of a new revolution, because now machines are capable of taking on jobs which they could not. Non-routine tasks suddenly open up in a very, very significant way. And given the way data storage capabilities are going up and costs are going down, and similarly the costs of computing, there is going to be a lot of move. And you also make the point that machine learning is in its nature a general purpose technology. It is not something that's going to just be influencing small portions of the way work is performed, but like electricity, it has the capability to influence just about everything. So we're really at something that's extremely transformative. And then you also go on to note that there could be many different kinds of jobs, but the way you describe them sort of leaves me wondering, because and in fact you said that closing, that it's going to significantly affect the distribution of income. So there could be very high levels of wage inequality or job polarization, as you said. There's also going to be a very, very significant maldistribution of economic power. So not merely in the workforce, where it's clearly divided into an elite workforce in cognitive tasks. And for those of us who are familiar with the Indian context of a workforce of around 470 million, if we actually reflect upon how many of their work, of the work resembles cognitive tasks, and the segment that Carl so powerfully points out is sort of where power is retained, that would barely be 30 million, out of which just about 5 million are in the IT sector itself, and there is a spillover into other modern sectors such as finance, management, and so on and so forth. It's barely 30 million. I'm probably being generous, Radhika, in a workforce of 470 million. And then there is also further maldistribution because of clustering, because it's not that space has vanished, and therefore there is a redistribution geographically, and also there's also redistribution in terms of the power across firms. So there is concentration of power even within firms. So then you have today just about 10 firms across the world who have incredible control over the space that you mentioned. I mean, innovations can spring up anywhere, but as Microsoft and Apple tell us, there are many different ways in which these superstar firms actually manage to gain control of those innovations, by buying them over or whatever else. And therefore, there's also economic concentration there. I mean, all of this I read in what you said. And then on the other hand, for example, a lot of the recommendations that you notice, in fact, which enabled, Frey's pause, which is the second industrial revolution in the United States in the entire period till about 1980, was a rather socially quiet period. Because at that time, wage share was roughly sort of constant, partly in turn contributed to by the World War or by New Deal, but also in terms of relative power of labor. And that has got disrupted now with this incredible maldistribution of economic power resulting in so the question is, therefore, in today's age, would you still pin your faith in the kind of interventions that you said? Because on the one hand you have democracy, but on the other hand you have a maldistribution of power. So how can states then use the instruments that you're saying to countervail, and can that sustain? Or would that in turn lead to a dystopia? That's my question. And the invitation, of course, is that we would really want to invite you to turn the same gaze that you've used, very rightly so, to the US to understand what's happening in today's world, or to England to understand what happened in the first industrial revolution, to look at a context which is actually not at the center, but very much at the margins. The margins doesn't mean that technological change has been less important, because in the first industrial revolution there were about 1 million weavers who were run out of jobs, and there's a rich debate on deindustrialization. Similarly, today this might actually cut off a lot of possibilities for India to transform into a modern economy. And therefore that's very much a part, not merely of technology, but the way capital is organized. But I would really invite you, in a sense, to turn your gaze upon not merely the center, but also to look at the periphery, because that will add to your knowledge in turn of what happens at the center. But I don't think the story of Manchester is complete without Manchester cloth being dumped in India, in a sense. So each would enrich the other. So my invitation is to come and spend some time here. But I also had that small question.
Thank you. So I realized first, before I go to that, I missed answering one of your questions, which is whether there are domains where we simply prefer to have human labor, even if something is potentially automatable. And I think restaurants are a great example of that. So one of the surprises in our studies actually, so most of us and most of the experts we asked to look into this thought that waiters and waitresses would be non-automatable. And the algorithms actually came back and told us that they were wrong, so they corrected for that. And in recent years, a company called Etsy has emerged, which is essentially a restaurant vending machine, which essentially cuts out the waiter from the process. So it's sort of cutting out the waiter through simplification. And I think that we may very well prefer that for lunch when we're in a rush and just want to eat as quickly as possible. But for a nice meal in the evening, we may very well prefer to have the sort of full service with the sommelier and all of this as part of the experience. And similarly, you see that in Japan, for example, it may also differ across cultures. So in Japan, robots are already being used in elderly care. In Sweden, where I'm from, that would be an outcry if that would happen, at least for now. So I do think that preferences play a very significant role in that. And with regard to future jobs and whether there will be enough jobs in tech and combined with personal services, the simple answer is that I don't know. But I think it's important to recall John Maynard Keynes' famous essay from the 1930s, in which he argued or predicts a 15-hour work week because he thinks that mechanization will essentially take over most jobs in agriculture, in mining, in manufacturing. And he was completely right about that. What he didn't foresee is we seem to be quite greedy, right? We seem to, want the newest iPhone, right? So even though they're sort of, still a smartphone, they're quality improvements, and we like to fool ourselves that the next iPhone is going to be better than the other one. So we are quite happy to replace that. We seem to be able to find new demands and so on and so forth. And there doesn't seem to be any particular saturation point related to people's well-being either. So in a recent study from Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers in the US suggests that up to 500,000 a year, which is the sort of span they have reliable data for, there doesn't seem to be any saturation point in terms of effects on people's well-being. Now, that may still be debatable and so on, and there's some studies sort of suggesting otherwise, but I think at the very least we shouldn't presume that there's going to be a huge job shortage, and history may not repeat itself, but the adoption of new technologies is going to be gradual, and for all these reasons that we have legislative hurdles, organizations are slow to adjust, there may be worker resistance, and so on and so forth. So it's not going to happen overnight, and if it turns out to be differently, we have time to plan for that. But right now, at least for the countries I'm looking at and for where we have good jobs data, it seems that there's a shortage of opportunities for people with a certain skill set, and that's mainly people who used to work in blue-collar jobs. But overall, the numbers seem to be doing quite okay. I think there is a lot of reason to be concerned about the concentration within industries. But I think there's some good news as well, in the sense that the time a company spends on average on the S&P 500 has fallen very significantly over the past 50 years. So there seem to be also quite a bit of churn among the largest corporations. And I do worry about the power that Google and Facebook and other companies have in affecting everything from elections to consumer behavior and so on. But I'm not necessarily of the view that their predominance is going to be indefinite. So it may well be a temporary monopoly. It may well be that we're going to restructure the internet in somehow, that people become owners of their own data. And Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, is already has a project with MIT researchers to redesign the internet in that way. So I worry about all of this, but I don't don't see necessarily this dystopian picture, and I do think that, you know, if we're going in that direction, we will still have time to come up with solutions. And the good thing is that in a democracy, you know, people do have more political voice than the Luddites did, and you know, it may take time for people to come together and agree upon what they want, and that's what happened with the labor movement as well, for example. You know, on balance, I remain optimistic about the long run, and slightly pessimistic about the short run.
My invitation stands, though.
Invitation is
So there's some mics here. There's a couple of hands there.
Good evening, sir. I'm Sanat. So, am I audible?
Here, but not there.
Hello? 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 Yeah, that's right. So, my question is, do you think part of the problem of employability comes from how we look at jobs? And it's from both ends, both from the job creators and the job seekers. So job creators front, so for example, when Boris Johnson was London's mayor, he started a movement of replacing the ticket offices with machines. And a pamphlet was issued by the TfL union which said that to the passengers that if you're new to London, please don't look for help. If you're disabled, please don't travel on the metro. If you are lost, please don't expect anyone to come. And the point was that they wanted to highlight that they are not there just to sell tickets, but there's some crucial care work that they're undertaking. And the care work aspect of jobs seems to be undermined because it's not considered real work. And from the job seekers side, there's the same problem because demand for jobs is shaped by more than incomes. It's also, jobs are looked as an active site for shaping the self, and care work is looked as something that might not make the life as meaningful or as purposeful. So if we restructure on how we look at jobs, do you think part of this problem can be tackled?
Let's take maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, two very quick questions. One is the lesson from the Industrial Revolution being that technological adoption decreases drudgery, increases productivity, but nevertheless also led to the increase in the length of the working day as well as exploitation of workers. So long story short, maybe after being Luddites, the workers do realize in some sense, what it is that they need to be looking at or fighting against. Secondly, in terms of AI as rudimentary as it is, could you give us some examples of what are the factors that affect failure? In other words, what would be the Blu-ray equivalent in the case of current AI technologies? And why are they so?
What would be the
Blu-ray DVD equivalent in the case of AI technologies, and what would be the reasons for them being so?
Yeah, hi. So you said you were pessimistic about the short term and mostly optimistic about the long term, but you also mentioned that the short term has lasted for such a long time, almost spanning entire lifetimes at different stages. So isn't that, doesn't that warrant speaking more about the short term itself?
No, it certainly does, and I think the short term has been a long time already, in a way. And I think it also begs the question why we haven't seen more resistance than we have so far. I think part of the reason may be that the rise in inequality has been offset, at least up until the financial crisis, with cheap credit, so people's consumption has been less affected. Part of the reason might be that there was a housing boom, so there was a lot of jobs emerging in the construction sector, and when the bubble burst with the financial crisis, that sort of offsetting factor vanished as well. And compared to the Industrial Revolution, I think it's also important to remember that working conditions were a lot more harsh than they are in the US or in the industrial West today. And people did riot against losing their jobs and income, but they also rioted against the social changes that were taking place. So most people before the Industrial Revolution worked, but they didn't have jobs, right? They worked for themselves at their own pace, not at the pace of the factory clock. They didn't have a boss looking over their shoulder. They were mostly worked in their home, surrounded by their children and their closest relatives. So the social changes were also enormous. So I think that the transitional pains this time around, at least in the industrial West, have not been quite as significant as during the Industrial Revolution. Otherwise, I think that we would have had a different outcome already. With regard to redefining and changing how we think about work, I'm all for that. I'm not sure exactly how to do that, but it has certainly changed over time, right? So, as I mentioned, people used to have work but didn't have jobs, and now people have gotten used to getting up at 7 in the morning, going to work and going home at 5, or depending on what work day you have. And now it seems almost unnatural in a way to work flexible hours or the hours you choose. That is gradually coming back with the gig economy, which has its upsides and its downsides, and those are no doubt going to be continue to be debated over the years to come. But something that you see actually, if you look at Britain, and I'm not sure if this is something that applies to other countries as well, is that people who are in a permanent job that work over 40 hours per week, they are very dissatisfied with their working day. People that chose their own hours, that work over 40 hours a week, you don't see the same very sharp break, and that may be because they are choosing the hours. Now, if that is how some people will want to work, then we have to rethink, social security and paid holidays and all of these things that used to be part of the work package that has emerged, and that we want people to also have access to. So I think there's a debate to be had around that as well. No, I'm sure there was another. I can't remember what it was. Can you repeat?
Do you want to repeat at least one of the two questions?
The second one.
What are the factors that determine failure of AI even at this rudimentary stage? So could you give me an example of that, and what are the factors which led to a failure of?
What do you mean by failure?
In terms of, let's say, from patent development to non-adoption or non-scaling up of an AI technology.
Right. I mean, I think there can be a variety of factors. I mean, scaling up and adoption of the technology is driven by so many factors beyond the technology as well. I think, in many cases, it's just a question of that the performance is not quite there yet, right? To the extent that it changes the business model. So if you think about, a company like Amazon, if they could predict exactly what you will click on next to buy, they would just ship things to your home before you even ordered them, right? And the very few instances in which they were wrong, you would send it back. And if they get things right 95% of the time, that may not be a feasible business model. But if they get it right 99.95% of the time, it may well be. So I think it's very much about sort of reaching that critical threshold. And there's so many different developments in AI that could be highlighted, and so many different models that can be used for different problems. So, in certain cases, for example, when it comes to medical treatment, you're not going to want to have a deep learning algorithm for which you don't have any probability distribution. You want to know the chances of something going wrong, because if something goes wrong, it goes terribly wrong. If Google Translate predicts the wrong word, nobody's going to die. So I think there's so many different developments that are happening parallel in the field. It's almost impossible to sort of pick out one and say this is the reason that adoption is failing.
We have time for one more round, so more questions. Don't be shy.
Since I have Hello. So, my question is that most of these technologies are based on machine learning. It's not. Most of the technology. Okay, now. Most of the technologies are based on machine learning, which try to learn from the human behavior. So there's been a recent debate in context, particularly of US, that how they also imitate human behavior which discriminates against, let's say, particular social identities. The entire policing system, which basically then tries to, marginalize a particular race and things that, always will blame a particular, I mean, there's a higher probability of the policing system thinking that people from particular racial groups would commit more crimes. There's been studies about how the job sites would show very gendered jobs to women, like high skilled, high productive jobs would not be featured for if women are looking for jobs. How, when you, and this relates to the point of when you showing that how, law, if the law, I mean, AI might be better in terms of having a more fair, practice in terms of law. But when these discriminations are being learnt by machines, can we really talk about a fair treatment whatsoever?
So that's a great question. So recently there was, I can't remember which company it was in the Valley that actually used AI to screen CVs and make hiring recommendations. Amazon was Amazon, and it did so on the basis of trying to predict, some successful hires, and it did hire, person's names and gender and so on and so forth, but simply by, looking at their activities, such as whether they played hockey and things like that, it turned out that, because Amazon employees are overwhelmingly men, it predicted, suggested similar candidates, and that reinforces, a bias that already exists in the industry. Now, I mean, if I go to the engineering science department in Oxford, I would say that the gender split is very different whether I go to the economics department and the business school, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. If it is that women are extremely being discouraged to apply for engineering science, or whether it's just that it's so male-dominated that some just don't want to apply there, or what the reasons are. But I think we need to think about those underlying causes in the first instance, and there's no way of solving that completely. It's about getting a representative sample of the entire population. That's what it's all about. If you don't just monitor, wealthy communities to report the potholes on the roads, you're just going to use AI to report potholes in wealthy communities and not in poor ones. It's as simple as that. So we need to have data samples that are representative of the population, and one new occupation may be AI auditor to look into potential biases and things like that. And I think it's actually already an occupational title, so, but there's no easy solution.
Just a comment.
But you can put your comment and then
yeah, so it's just something which came out, that this entire fear that AI is going to eventually replace jobs comes out. I mean, it's interesting, and I don't know how to really analyze it right now. Comes out with all sorts of statements. So the CEO of Alibaba in China has been pushing for a legislation which talks about a 6 days a week sort of a regularized work, where you would be working 12 hours a day. So from 6 to 6, 6 days a week. And that is the formula he's giving. The justification is that because AI is coming in, a lot of jobs are going to be lost. So in order to prevent that, workers need to expand in terms of the amount of working hours they put in. And it sort of ties into the question which was raised earlier, that how do we look at the question of technology and where does resistance and to what the resistance needs to, be aimed at. It's just an observation.
Just to add to that, like sometimes this fear that the machines are coming, going to take your job, is just suppressing the market.
Yeah. I have a different question because I have an interest and followed artificial intelligence for a long time. But nowadays, the AI refers to a lot of ambiguous stuff. And most of us, what we talk about in this discussion, mostly about data analysis to have a predictive behavior. And we are terming mostly that is artificial intelligence. And what is your view on that? And the second thing is, when we look at job market, we almost take it as homogeneous given our past history. And if you really refer to latest work by David Graeber from London School of Economics, and he called his study bullshit jobs. If you really look at the kind of mix of jobs that we mostly do worldwide, he made a good analysis of what all of them are really contributing and what are there just for the sake of being there. So if you look at that job market, as somebody asked very relevantly, that should we have a relook at the works that we are doing? If you really look at that, the job market doesn't look any more homogeneous in the history. These are the two things I just wanted to ask you. AI, in generally perceived today, looks to me like little short-sighted. Thanks.
If I understood correctly, one point you're making is that the way we are talking about AI is quite a narrow domain. It's about data analysis and pattern recognition, prediction, and so forth. Is your question that it's actually broader, or that it's not, that we are talking about a very... Could it be broader?
The word refers to a broader science.
Yeah, okay.
But what we are actually putting as an example is mostly predictive analysis in terms of the business use of AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally right, and we're very much focusing on the first order effects and not the second and third order effects. I think, I mean, if you think about AI-driven autonomous vehicles, for example, and if you think about the electrification of transportation, that would probably mean that gas stations will disappear, and if gas stations disappear, some consumption related to those gas stations, mainly tobacco and I think sweets and other things that people buy, will probably suffer from that. If you are going to replace the internal combustion engine with batteries, that will mean that all producers of car parts that go into that are going to take a hit as well. It may well be that if we have a completely autonomous car, we will want to have it designed completely differently, so there's no need to have a driver's seat and a steering wheel, and we may have a coffee or a table in the middle and chairs around and so on and so forth. We could probably make vehicles much more lighter and cheaper to produce, and so on and so forth. So obviously there are so many effects, and it's for so many potential applications of artificial intelligence, and it's extremely hard to predict all of those. So I mean, I would encourage people to sort of focus maybe on one narrow domain in which they have most of their expertise, and then you sort of maybe start to aggregate it up to something meaningful. But it is extremely difficult to get the full picture. I agree with you. With regard to the bullshit jobs work by David Graeber, which I also enjoyed reading, it's a very witty essay. I think most large-scale surveys actually suggest that people put a lot of meaning to their work, and even in those jobs that he deemed to be bullshit jobs, so it's just flat out wrong.
There's actually, there's a question. No, yeah, please go ahead.
What I find is that there is something lacking in sort of the mainstream economist view, right from the initial formulation of the SBTC model to Otter's task-based conceptualization, where technology is treated exogenously, right? It's that, so what it does not address, for instance, is how, I mean, let's say in, after the task-based formulation came about, that countries that found themselves on the same technological frontier were impacted differently when it came to the distribution of, or the impact of technology on the jobs within those countries. So, I mean, an example that comes to mind right now is that in Germany, for instance, in manufacturing, there is a higher density of robots than in the US, but it has not seen a, but Germany has not seen a similar decline in employment shares, share as has been the case in Germany. So, to me, one reason has been that focus on cobots in Germany, right, where the adoption of robots has been those that work collaboratively with workers as opposed to those that replace workers. So again, the idea being that to me, something is lacking in that we, even today, for instance, a lot of the discussion has been about AI is going to be impacting us in such a manner, but we do not, we fail to grapple with why is it that AI came into being, or why is it that this specific kind of technology is the one that is being adopted. So, and that, I mean, not only does it have like, put the question of like an origin story for technology, let's say, but also it has deeper implications for impact going forward too. So, I mean, what would a model, like coming from a research point of view, what would a model of analysis or of investigation look like where technology is not treated as this exogenous variable that interacts with somewhat efficient markets and thus values labor accordingly?
It's a great question. So I mean, I fully agree with you that economists don't provide the full picture, and there's a tendency in the field in trying to break down very complex questions into as simple question as possible in order to be able to say anything meaningful about them. And as a result of that, we are much better at sort of identifying causal relationships between variables, but we're often missing the full picture as a result of that. And you can argue, that the literature taken together, that, in a cumulative way, that a more complete picture is emerging through efforts by many different scholars than would otherwise been possible. But I think there's a tendency to sort of miss the forest for the trees. And I mean, to take your example about Germany, yeah, Germany is a different country with different set of institutions, with different set of different training system. Labor unions are much stronger. You have union leaders on corporate boards, and all sorts of things are different. So would you expect the exact same outcomes in Germany even? Probably not. I think the study finds, though, that robots actually reduce employment in the manufacturing sector, but not on the aggregate, if I recall it correctly. But you wouldn't necessarily expect the same relationship to hold everywhere either, because we don't estimate in where boundary conditions are invariant, right? I do think that we need a much better understanding of the drivers behind technological change. Most economists treat technologies as falling down from the sky and don't pay much attention to why they were invented in the first place. I try to discuss some of that in my book, but I don't have the full picture either. I would recommend your Bokir's work on that. He argues very much that it was driven by Enlightenment ideas and the connection between the scientific revolution to the industrial revolution that essentially sort of merged it all together. The problem with that, obviously, it's almost impossible to actually prove. Or some people argue that it was new culture emerged with the rise of the merchant class in Britain and placed more emphasis on work rather than having a refined leisure. And some people argue that was the Protestant work ethic as defined by Max Weber. And we can discuss and debate that, and some studies suggest that they might have had points. Most studies seem to suggest, well, it actually, what the printing press did was that it increased literacy and paved the way for higher levels of education, and that is what drove economic development thereafter, and that, you know, the translation of the Bible did, and Luther is essentially creating a common language and incentivizing education. So that was sort of the transmission mechanism. But yeah, it's very much a debated issue. So I didn't give you an answer, but at least I talked for a bit.
Just to add one thing to that, I mean, your question made me think also of, you know, just the fact that so much of economics has been about analyzing markets and much less about production. I mean, setting aside Marx and so forth, obviously, the Marxian tradition has always been interested in production. So it was, in a way, that question was very easy to miss, because a lot of these technical decisions are about production, they're about profit, they're about a lot of things that capitalists would do. You know, in the Marxian model, it is very easy to talk about endogenizing technical change, but it's much more difficult to do if your starting position is just individuals, firms, and, you know, the kind of standard trappings. I'm not saying everybody does that, but that would be. But I just want to very quickly make 2 points. One is actually about Radhika's thing about, you know, do people prefer certain things to be delivered by humans? And very interestingly, what you find, especially with services, is that as automation proceeds, the elite market is actually the human market at this point. Right? That has become the selling point. That we don't give you we give you a person to do whatever it is that you're doing, and that is true for a range of services now. Which, if you're poor, you get the machine. If you're rich, you get the human. And there's a clear. I mean, what that shows to me is that there is a human preference for humans. It's just a question of whether humans at some point will become a luxury good, you know, that only some people can afford. So that's one thing. The other is the AI point. Very recently I came to know of, in India, a company where workers, their job is to look at social media posts for American cities and categorize those posts as favorable, unfavorable, neutral, etc. And that creates a dashboard for city administrators in the US to use on their cities. And a lot of this, if you don't know the back-end work, and this includes a lot of other curation that goes on in the web all the time, it looks to you like something smart is happening with machines. But actually there's a lot of people that are just sitting there and doing a lot of curation and a lot of analysis that then at the front end just comes to you as delivered. You never even see the labor that has gone into it. So it really made me think of where the human element of AI, well, it's not really AI anymore, but you know, what might look to you as an AI is.
I just have one point to make in response to what you said in terms of drivers of technological change. Probably what we look at in today's age might be very different from what we were looking at the first industrial revolution. And there's a fascinating discussion underway now in the US on the superstar firms on the technological firmament. And there's a distinction between innovation, which is for smart people sitting in their garage and figuring a new way of solving things, to how is it that Apple or Microsoft actually picks that innovation and magnifies its power, and then it starts prevailing. So in fact, there is a far greater understanding of the second. I mean, the first might be a random process of intellectual thought, you know, creativity. That's okay. That's happened sort of, zillions of occasions. But what people are trying to see is that the process whereby the technology gets dominant is so closely linked with what the firms have to do in terms of how they seek to dominate either the market or the workplace. And in fact, that's the thing which eventually, when Carl discusses, you know, power and the role of the state, it is there. It's not so much in the process of innovation, but it's more in the process of how it gets stepped up from something to dominate, is really where there needs to be greater socialization. There needs to be greater discussion and control. So that it's more the driver of not merely just innovation, but actually how does it then dominate forms of production or this thing. And people are thinking about it, not necessarily always from a progressive lens, because even these corporates are thinking about it as they seek to sort of concentrate and accumulate more economic power.
And thank you also very much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure, and I'm very, very happy to pick up on your invitation. Thanks very much. Thanks.